to discuss today something related to Gramsci, his idea of man, what is man, which is very important because within the ambit of English literature, English studies, or critical theory, whenever we discuss Gramsci, we plunge more or less headlong into the question of the subaltern, which are important for syllabus and all that. But subaltern, who is subaltern, who is not, etc. These have to be logically premised on the greater question of what is man. That is the title, at least in translation. Of course, here it is, old usage. By man, man, woman, and all other genders are included because that was the practice. If Gramsci, was writing today, he would have been writing as human or the equivalent to human in his original writing. Now, Gramsci says in this essay, this is the primary and main question of philosophy, you know, both ontologically and epistemologically. Ontology related to our existence, and epistemology, of course, knowledge. First, we have to know what is man, and then he progresses somewhat, like a deconstructionist, or rather a Socratic thinker. That then, to answer what is man, possibly the first approach would be individual, he says. But then he says, I'm not interested in that kind of an approach, because in that case, you have to ask, say, around 600 crore men and women are there. You have to ask each of them, each and every one of them, that what do you think a man is or humanity is? And then it will be an endless process. And he says, and that will further be complicated by the fact that each individual, is a different person in in different moments. So you have to possibly take care of all those moments also. So there will be hundreds and thousands and lakhs and crores of definition of what is man. So he says we will not go into that kind of an approach, but then the question, he says, would be of what man can become actually. So, in other words, for Gramsci, what is man can be best answered by what man can become. And I'm reminded of a very famous quote, though quite unrelated, by Swami Vivekananda, that religion, he used to say, but religion is very important for him, is all about being and becoming. It is not, worshipping and this and that, but just being and becoming. So, similarly, in Gramsci, we see this. And then, if we have spoken about religion, Gramsci too has done it. And then the first instance, for a take-off point, he starts with the question of Catholicism, because that was the dominant religion that he saw. He was operating from Italy, not England. Otherwise, he would have spoken about Protestantism. But more or less, these are the same things. So, yeah, good afternoon. Though now the thing is that by Aviraj is here, I think. So, good afternoon, good to see you. I mean, I just started it like that. So, possibly you will find it interesting. Now, you see, Catholicism or Protestantism, there are differences, nuances rather, but more or less their idea about man more or less finally same. And not only in that, in almost all religions, almost, I said, not all because I don't know about all, and at least in Indic traditions there are certain religions, Vedanta tradition, Buddhism, Jainism, etc. They are not exactly premised on a theocentric or God-centric kind of understanding of man, but more or less major religions, or Hinduism in its practiced form, more or less the idea of man is more or less same. It is determined. It is determined always already by scriptures, by God. So Catholicism, Gramsci says that it roots the cause of all evil in man himself, that is, man as clearly defined and limited individual. So religion would say, why you are suffering? Because you committed some sin. That is the main approach. Maybe in previous birth, this birth and all that, depending on that. So it is your responsibility. But then the fact does not take into account so many of exterior things that are there, that we exist within, and the forces that are constantly with checks and balances changing our trajectories. We are not autonomous that way, though we are made to think so by religious thought, which are also important, but what one point of view. So that is why Gramsci says, I have spoken about relationships, that we have to move outside this Catholic understanding of man, and then, or I would say religious, changing Catholicism a bit in Gramsci, and then we'll have to see man in a series of relationships. We can be understood in a series of relationships actually to other things. The first, he gives a three-stage kind of thing with which we can understand or define man. The first one is the individual aspect, which nonetheless is there with all of us. If we consciously think about us and all, what are our predilections, our priorities, and all that, we'll know. But that doesn't suffice, and often these things are personal. The second, he says, more importantly, man in relation to other men. And third, and here I find, Gramsci almost prophetic, is very different from his contemporary thinkers. You must remember he died in 1937, way before this eco-critical movement and all had started. But the third axis that he adds to the understanding of man is man with relation to nature. So these three things, he says, are very important. One is man in himself, that has to be understood, but that is quite personal. For students like us, critics like us, will try to understand man in relation to other men, and then in relation to nature. Then he says, it is slightly contrary to what I have said earlier, that it is not that our relationship with other men influences us only, or our relationship with nature influences us only in a unilinear way. It is reciprocal. We also influence other men. Here you will find the root of the kind of theories given by Bhabha and others that didn't mention Gramsci, but this reciprocal element, that we are being determined, but we also determine to some extent. The same with nature. Man also, influences nature, and then it's not only influenced by them. So thank you, I will reply later, and then because I was flow, and then very good afternoon. So therefore, I quote, one can say that man changes himself, modifies himself to the same extent that he changes and modifies the whole complex of relationships of which he is the nexus. So in man, in each individual man, woman, and say third gender and all people, and collectively in men, we are the center in which all these relationships play out. So for that, second important part is, this is one part, for example, that what is man and how man is to be understood. The second part is, very important part is, the importance or significance of history. Of course, it is there in the Marxist tradition, and Gramsci is operating from within that tradition, but he emphasizes it. And here, I can only say that history is very important. We know nothing that has not existed. So even if this is the comment that I made, I find it very interesting, my own comment, that we cannot know anything which doesn't exist. So in any case, our knowledge is knowledge of past only. So here, since I am operating from the Indian situation, and possibly it is a global situation, I don't know, I'm not aware. So in Indian situation, for example, these two kind of, or I may say this is the third world situation, two kinds of extreme polar views regarding history. One view is that extreme traditionalism, not history that is the past, that we must protect whatever was there in past, and we must follow, keep repeating this endlessly. That kind of idea is there across religions, across communities, this kind of reverence for the past. In his Discovery of India, Jawaharlal Nehru said something very interesting regarding this habit. Edward Said also said, T.S. Eliot also said, I will use Said's comment, that appeals to the past, is one of the commonest strategies, it was a slip, to understand the present. And perhaps it cannot but be otherwise. But then there is another angle, as I said. in many Hindi movies, for example, which are our scriptures, it has become like that. So from 80s and at least 90s, there was a kind of, you know, sentiment about total rejection of past, that we need not bother about past. That is equally or rather more dangerous, I would say, because that ignores the main thing, as I have said, that we can know our past only. What is future actually we cannot know. That is coming, that is in the process of becoming and not being. Past is only being, to go back to Vivekananda's being and becoming. So these two aspects, but then the past for understanding and not for endless repetition of whatever has been there in the past only because it has been there in the past. In this regard, I find Sri Aurobindo's lectures or formations on the foundations of Indian culture very interesting. Aurobindo had a global outlook, though based on Indian spirituality. He was, for example, you know, of the view that we have to adopt democracy even if it had not been there in Indian culture, Indian past. It's slightly contested. Some say the practices were there, especially the Mahajanapadas, but by and large we know that we had monarchy. So Aurobindo says that it doesn't matter that democracy is in its present form is of European origins, because it is not that Europeans have to be shunned out from the course of history entirely. That will be a reverse colonialism. So democracy is good for all. So it doesn't matter whether it has come from Europe or Uzbekistan. That is all. So we adopt that. So whatever is good for human, that was also the logic of this Indian Renaissance, so-called the best things of the East and the West, so combination. But often it took a very predictable, or rather a kind of, visibly symbolic form, not going into the deep of that fusion that could have happened. Now, that is why coming back to that past is very important. So Gramsci says that we must know that what has existed before, to know the genesis, the impulse of their formation, because each individual is not only the synthesis of existing relations, but also the history of this relation. You, me, each of us, we don't exist only in the moment. So the synthesis of these elements that you say, man in relation to nature, with other men and all, is not only about today's, but our forefathers, our families, all that had happened, that speaks through my language, through my gene, whatever, everyone. So that also had to be known. But again, as I said, not for an endless repetition in veneration, and not also outright rejection. There may be many, there were good things in the past. At least from, even from ecological point of view, forget spiritual point of view, most of the traditional cultures are much more eco-friendly. So while we celebrate the rational, contour of scientific civilization, the other part of science is technology, which has landed all of us in great crisis today. So in that regard, our ancestors, our means not only Hindu or Indian, globally, ancestors naturally lived in more eco-friendly setting. So those values, can be imbibed or can be revived. Related to that, there is another point he says in way of illustration, as a continuation of his idea of, how we have to understand man, network of relationship, the food factor in that same as a what is man, which is again very important, because a lot of fuss is going on all over the world related to food. Veganism, for instance, is the order of the day. Not even vegetarianism, which has very Indic origins, but veganism. Say you don't take milk product, honey, anything related to it. And in most cases, the logic given kind of is that you are what you eat. That I also don't agree personally. I personally feel vegetarianism is a better way of life. Possibly that is not logical, but it's my personal feeling. But my preference is based on the idea of, say, non-violence, especially of Buddhism and Jainism, ahimsa. But that is not how the current veganism and other things are often peddled. So the major idea that they give is you are what you eat. You will find in many TV channels, and one kind of, what we can say, influencer was put into trouble by an interlocutor when the influencer said that you are what you eat. So if you eat an animal, you become that animals. And the interlocutor or this audience, the argumentative Indian and asked back, then since you say you have been eating cabbages, would you like to say that you are a cabbage right now? It's logical, isn't it? So if we become, what we eat only, then it is not restricted to only animals. If we eat vegetables, we become vegetables. So Gramsci rejects that idea with a very logical thinking. He says that it is not that, what we eat directly gets assimilated to us in that form. It's a very basic science. You eat any animal, any vegetable, ultimately what will happen? In the digestive system, in stomach, intestine, and all those things, it is basically broken down into those basic forms. That is protein, carbohydrates, vitamin, minerals, etc. So that is what we get finally, not cabbage as such, or goat as such, or chicken as such. So it is a faulty argument to say that you are what you eat. But yes, he says, to some extent it is true, but he says it is much in the sense of you are what you wear. That is, what you eat or what you wear shows your historical or cultural background, and I would say geographical background, because foods have been originally based on regions, geographical regions. So in brief, I would say, and finally he says, all is politics, philosophy as well as the philosophies. That is the conclusion. And the only philosophy is history in action. That we often, and here, Foucault's side and all of this come in, we often separate philosophy, culture, etc. from politics. No, these are all equally political. There is nothing which is apolitical, and then the only respite to save ourselves from overarching domination of any particular kind of politics or ideology or hegemony is to have counter politics, counter ideology, counter hegemony. I am not talking here of party politics or with reference to any party, but then thought process, overwhelming thought process. So it in other ways, it is like saying that the way to come out of others' narratives is to create your own narratives. So that is why I think, I would conclude here, we should go back to Gramsci again and again, and not only for the subaltern, but this essay on men is of extreme and, crucial significance. And of course, I would like to add the last part, is directly Marx, that even philosophy is political. Marx had said that philosophers have only interpreted the world. It is about time we change it. So Marx was a very syncretic thinker. People often misread him. Marx has not dismissed the philosophers, you see. Interpretations are good, he says. Implies interpretation, but the next step is action. We have to act according to them. But then our contemporary Marxist Zizek Shahab says that, that we have possibly acted too much. He is also a Marxist and neo-Marx, so he reverses Marxist paradigm and says that don't act, think. Then I would say that we should think also, act also. That is the message of, karma yoga of that Gita, where Krishna says, good old Gita tells Arjuna that it is only the foolish who say that action and contemplation are separate from one another. It is childish to say so, the wise do not think so. So you must know as well as act. That is the message of the Gita. Samkhya yogo prithak valaha pravadanti na panditaha ekam api asthitang samyag ubhayor vindate phalam. So both lead to the same goal. If you do one properly, you reach the other side. Anyway, apparently there is a vast difference between Gramsci and Gita, though both start with the sarva. But somehow, in a way, it's my contribution. I've tried to relate that more or less both walk towards the same goal, at least so far as this ethics and epistemology, politics and gnosis separation thing is there. It's not like that. But thank you very much for listening. My speech is not that important, but what is important is this essay by, Gramsci. Thank you.